Welcome to Pomodoro Joe for Friday, September 8th, 2023. Today we're looking at LeetCode problem 118, Pascal's triangle. This is an easy problem, although it's really not that easy. All right, let's see what we got. Given an integer, num rows, return the first num rows of Pascal's triangle. In Pascal's triangle, each number is the sum of the two numbers directly above it. All right, we've got this example here. So you start out with 1 at the very top, and then 1, 1 in row 2. But then when you get to row 3, you start with 1, then you go to 2 in the middle because you sum these two elements that are just above it. And then you go to 1 at the end again. All right, and then we keep going until we get to num rows. All right, and it looks like our constraints start us at 1. Cool. So let's put 25 minutes on the Pomodoro timer and we will get started. So for this, it looks like we need to return a list of lists. So we'll have some result, and we'll set it equal to an empty list to start, and then we will return our result at the end. Okay, so for this one, we'll be going row by row until we reach num rows, and then we'll return the num rows, or our result, at the end. Now it looks like we need to start out with something in our very first row, and we have at least one row. So we can actually start our result as a list that contains a list with just 1. So it's a list of a list that has the number 1 in it. All right, now we have to go through every other row. So for, let's call this row in range, we already have one row, so we'll start at 1, and we'll go to num rows. All right, so this will take us through the rest of the rows. Okay, so what do we have to do? Well, let's have our new row, and we'll start that out as an empty list. And actually, we've already got 1. We already know that the very first element in our row will be a 1. So let's start it out as 1, a list with 1. And now we have to go through every other element in the list. We've got the first one covered, but we have to go through element 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So for, let's see, this will be element in range. Oh, let's see, we have to go from 1, because we've already got the first element covered. We go from 1 to our row length. Well, how long is our row? Let's see, for now I'll just pass in here. We need to know how many elements are in this row. How many elements are in our row? Well, for the first row, there's 1. For the second row, there's 2. For the third row, there's 3. So it looks like our number of elements is just our row. Okay, so row length is equal to our row. All right, and now we just have to go through our row and look at the row above it. So we have to look at the previous row. So, I don't actually have the previous row here. So let me get the previous row. Our previous row, that's the row that's above this row. Well, that's going to equal our result at the end. That's the last element in our result, so we can use -1. So I'll look at my previous row, and I've got our, let's call them A and B, so the first element that's just slightly to the left, and then B, which is the element that's slightly to the right. So let's call this A equals, I don't know yet, and B equals, again, I don't know yet. So then our current row, this new row, will just append A plus B. All right, so now we'll go through, we'll calculate our element, we'll put it into our row, and let's see at the very end here. Now we do have to be a little bit careful because there are some edge cases, like the very beginning, our first element, it doesn't have 2 elements above it, so we just fill that in with 1. Same thing with the end, our last element doesn't actually have 2 elements above it, it just has 1. So we don't want to go all the way to the last element. We want to go to the second to last element, and then we'll just add a 1 as the last element of this row. So our new row will just append 1. And then we do need to put this whole new row into our result. So our result will append this new row. Okay, now we have to get to the meat of the problem. We actually have to add our 2 elements. We actually have to find these 2 elements. Well, let's look at our example here. This will be element at index 0. Then in the second row, we have element at index 0 and index 1. It looks like, okay, so elements at index 0 and index 1 will feed into my element at index 1. So my element at index 1 here will be the sum of element at index 1 minus 1 and the element of index 1 minus 0. Okay, so it's the element itself and then the element at its index minus 1. Okay, so A will be the previous row at index element minus 1, and then B will be the previous row at this element. Again, we can look at this just to verify that's true. So if we're at index 1 right here, index 1 will take index 0 from the previous row plus index 1 of the current row. So that's element minus 1 plus the element at this index itself. Okay, and at the end we return our result. So I think everything looks good so far. But one thing I didn't really note, and I should probably note this here. Remember how I said we don't want to go all the way to the end, the row length. We want to go to the end minus 1 element, and then we fill in that last element with index 1. Well, this range is a non-inclusive range. So this actually will go from 1 to the row length, not including the row length itself. So that's how we skip going to this very last element. Okay, let's see. I think we might be done. So we start our result as a list of just a list containing element 1. Then we'll go through from 1 to the number of rows. So we'll calculate every row. We create our new row. We started off with just 1 at the very first position. And then we do need to keep track of our previous row. So we'll grab our previous row from our result. We'll just look at the end of our result array, and that's our previous row. Then for every element in this new row, I just look up at the previous row, find A and B, that's the slightly above and to the left and slightly above and to the right elements. We'll add those together and put them in our new row. At the very end, we add 1 as our last element, and then we add our whole new row to our result. Okay, let's give it a shot, see how we do. And it works. Let's see if we can pass all the tests. And we pass. And we don't do great. We only beat 30% for runtime and 70% for memory, so not great. But we could come in here, let's see what could we do to make this a little bit faster. We could change some of these names. These names are rather long names, so let's change a couple of things here. We'll keep result because I like that. Num rows we're not going to change. This row, we can make this I, or maybe I'll call it R. And this row length, we are just assigning this row length to row, so we don't actually need this row length. We could just put that directly in here, I. So our new row, our previous row, all right, and then element, we can just call this E. All right, makes that a little bit shorter. And then we also don't need A and B, we could just embed those in here, but I kind of like it the way it is. Let's see if that saves us anything. Oh, I called this R, not I. There we go. All right, that gives us a huge win. Now we're at 63% for runtime, 71% for memory. So we were at 30% and we just doubled our speed by changing some of our variable names. Now we're at 63% for runtime and 71% for memory. I bet we can get even faster if we got rid of some of these things. Now, I don't know if this actually makes a ton of difference, but let's give it a shot. Now, I don't recommend doing this because I think it will make the code uglier, but let's do this. Yeah, this definitely is uglier code. I don't recommend this at all. And it doesn't even help. It drops us down to a 40%. So we did better with our nicer code with the A and B. All right, last thing I will try, I'll just get rid of some of these gaps here. I don't recommend this either because this is harder to understand, harder to parse, but that's okay. I mean, harder to visually parse. And that gets us to an 84% for runtime and a 71% for memory. So yeah, that's not bad. All right, well, I think that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. I hope you can go out and write better code.